The year is 1740. Somewhere on a South Carolina plantation, before the sun has fully risen, a woman is already awake. She is not cooking for herself. She will not eat what she is making, but her hands move with a certainty that does not belong to anyone who has ever been told they are powerless. She reaches into a rough-hewn wooden mortar, pulls a handful of dried grain from a cloth sack, and begins to pound. The sound echoes across the still morning air, a rhythm almost musical. What she is making will one day feed a nation that will spend centuries pretending it invented the dish itself. What is the most eaten grain dish in American history? Most people will say corn, some will say wheat, a few will guess rice. They are all wrong. The answer is rice, but not the rice story you have been told. The rice that built the American South, that appeared on the tables of presidents, that still sits in nearly every American pantry today, that rice did not come from European agricultural knowledge. It came from West Africa, from a region so skilled in rice cultivation that slave traders specifically sought people from there, not just for their labor, but for their knowledge. This is the story of how enslaved people took a grain, a memory, and a technique, and fed an entire civilization that refused to credit them. To understand this story, you have to go back further than the American colonies. You have to go to a stretch of coastline in West Africa that European traders quietly named the Grain Coast, and later, the Rice Coast. This region, running roughly through present-day Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Senegal, had been cultivating a specific species of rice called Oryza glaberrima for over 3,000 years before a single European ship ever appeared on the horizon. African rice, indigenous rice, a completely separate domestication from the Asian varieties the world now mostly grows. By the 14th century, communities across this region had developed one of the most sophisticated rice cultivation systems on Earth. They built tidal floodplains. They engineered salt barriers. They bred varieties suited to specific soil types: inland swamp rice, upland dry rice, tidal rice. They knew this plant the way only generations of intimate knowledge can produce. Rice was not just food here. It was currency. It was dowry. It was the measure of a household's wealth and a chief's power. A woman who could grow, process, and cook rice well was a woman of standing. Then in the early 1600s, English colonists arrived on the coast of what would become South Carolina and Georgia. They tried to grow food. They failed repeatedly. The land was swampy, hot, and nothing like England. They planted wheat and watched it rot. They planted barley and watched it die. What they did not understand, and could not understand, was that the land they had claimed was almost identical in geography and climate to the rice-growing regions of West Africa. The same tidal flooding, the same heavy summer rains, the same thick, dark lowland soil. They had the land, they just did not have the knowledge. So they went to get it in the most brutal way imaginable. African rice, Oryza glaberrima, looks different from the long, white polished grains most people picture today. It is shorter, darker at the hull. When cooked using traditional methods, it carries a slightly nutty depth that Asian rice varieties do not have. Elders in Sierra Leone and Guinea who still grow it describe the flavor as fuller, heavier in the mouth, more satisfying in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has only ever eaten commercial white rice. But what made this rice remarkable was not just the grain itself, it was everything built around it. The West African rice tradition was a complete system. From seed selection, women carefully choosing which grains to keep for planting based on size, color, and resilience, to the tidal engineering that flooded and drained fields on a seasonal rhythm, to the processing methods that transformed raw paddy into table-ready rice with minimal equipment and maximum precision. Central to that processing was the mortar and pestle, the same tool our woman in South Carolina was using before sunrise. In West Africa, rice pounding was women's work, not in the diminishing sense that phrase often carries, but in the sense that it was skilled, respected, essential labor. Young girls learned from their mothers and grandmothers. The technique was specific, a tilting, rotating motion that husked the grain without crushing it. Done wrong, you got broken rice and flour. Done right, you got whole, clean, beautiful grains ready for the pot. This knowledge, this tactile, embodied knowledge passed through hands and mortar and years of practice, crossed the Atlantic inside the people who carried it. On the rice plantations of colonial South Carolina, the process began not in a kitchen but in a field. The enslaved workers, many brought specifically from the rice coast of West Africa, recognized the land immediately. The tidal rivers, the marshy lowlands, the seasonal flood patterns. They knew what this landscape was for, even if their enslavers did not. They engineered the fields themselves. Dug by hand, the tidal floodplain systems they created in South Carolina directly mirrored the ones their ancestors had built in West Africa. Banks to control water flow. Sluice gates, called trunks, to let the tide in and out on a schedule. Channels that directed water across acres of planted rows. Planters took credit for this in their letters and records. The actual engineering knowledge came entirely from the people doing the building. At harvest, the rice was cut with a small curved blade called a sickle, gathered into bundles and left to dry in the field sun for several days. Then came thrashing, beating the bundles against wooden frames or the ground to separate the grain from the stalk. Then came the work that made the finished product possible, processing. The mortar, hollowed from a single hardwood log, often 4 feet tall, stood in the yard of every enslaved household. The pestle, equally heavy, equally carved by hand. Women worked in pairs, alternating strokes in a practiced rhythm, one lifting as the other struck, so the work could continue for hours without stopping. Fanning came after. The processed grain was poured into wide, flat baskets, coil-woven in a style directly descended from West African basketry and tossed in the air. The wind carried away the chaff. The grain fell back clean. Every step of this process, from field engineering to mortar technique to basket weaving, was African knowledge, applied in American soil, under American bondage. In the plantation houses of South Carolina, rice appeared on the table at nearly every meal. It was the centerpiece of what became known as Carolina gold rice, named for its golden husk, which commanded premium prices in markets from London to the Caribbean. By the mid-1700s, South Carolina was the wealthiest colony in British North America. That wealth was built almost entirely on rice, and that rice was built almost entirely on knowledge that had been forcibly imported alongside the people who held it. What the planters never fully grasped, or perhaps never wanted to acknowledge, was that they had not simply purchased labor. They had purchased an entire agricultural civilization, and that civilization, even in chains, continued to express itself. In the small garden plots enslaved people were sometimes permitted, they grew their own food. Rice appeared there, cooked in ways that had nothing to do with the plantation kitchen. Red rice, rice and black-eyed peas, rice cooked in palm oil or seasoned with whatever spice could be found or traded. These were not imitations of African cooking. They were African cooking, adapted, compressed, surviving. The dish that would eventually become known as Hoppin' John, rice cooked with black-eyed peas, a staple of Southern American cuisine eaten for luck on New Year's Day, traces directly back to the rice and beans combinations that were a daily survival meal in West African food culture. Gumbo, the thick rice-based stew synonymous with Louisiana cooking, takes its name from the Bantu word kai ngombo, meaning okra. The okra came from Africa. The technique of thickening with okra came from Africa. The gumbo file powder used as a thickener came from the Choctaw people. The European roux was added later. Almost every element of what Americans call Southern food has a direct African origin. It was the cuisine of the enslaved, and it became the cuisine of the nation. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the rice economy of South Carolina collapsed almost immediately. Without enslaved labor, the plantation system could not sustain itself. The knowledge required to maintain the tidal floodplain systems was so specialized, so dependent on generational expertise, that without the people who had built and maintained them for over a century, there was no replacing it. Fields flooded uncontrolled. Banks crumbled. The carefully engineered landscape began returning to swamp. Carolina gold rice, once the finest rice in the Western world, essentially vanished from commercial production by the early 20th century. African rice, Oryza glaberrima, was gradually displaced across West Africa itself by Asian varieties introduced during the colonial period, which produced higher yields under industrial farming but lacked the flavor complexity of the original. The women who carried the knowledge of the mortar, the fanning basket, the tidal field, their names were never recorded. The planters who profited from their expertise left behind thousands of letters, ledgers, and land deeds. The people whose knowledge made all of it possible left behind almost nothing the historical record chose to preserve. What they left behind instead was in the food, in the gumbo, in the hoppin' john, in the red rice still cooked in Gullah Geechee communities along the South Carolina and Georgia coasts, descendants of the same West African rice farmers who never stopped making it the old way. There is a particular kind of theft that history rarely names directly, not the theft of labor, that much has been documented, but the theft of credit, the erasure of origin, the slow process by which a people's deepest knowledge becomes absorbed into a national identity that pretends it was always theirs. American food culture is built on African hands, African seeds, and African memory. The rice in your pantry right now carries that history, whether the label says so or not. And somewhere in Sierra Leone, in a village where women still rise before the sun and reach for the mortar, the rhythm continues. The same rhythm that crossed the Atlantic in chains and fed a nation that is still, slowly, learning to say thank you.